Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before starting the video, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button and this video a like up. Leonard Nimoy is synonymous with playing Mr. Spock in Star Trek, the original series, but the legendary actor and director turned down playing the Vulcan twice, and he was right to do so. Nimoy's tenure as Spock spans 3 seasons of Star Trek, the original series, Star Trek, the animated series, a guest spot on Star Trek, Next Generation, and 8 Star Trek movies. Leonard Nimoy innovated and defined numerous aspects of Vulcans in Star Trek, the original series, including the Vulcan hand gesture and the Vulcan nerve pinch. In the 1980s, Nimoy moved behind the camera and became the celebrated director of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and 3 Men and a Baby. However, there were points in time when Leonard Nimoy sought to distance himself from his Vulcan alter ego, and he was also in conflict with Paramount, Star Trek's parent studio. Nimoy prided himself on playing Spock, and there were 2 instances when Leonard rejected plans to return as Spock to protect the Vulcan's integrity and his own. In the 1970s, Leonard Nimoy wrote an autobiography titled, I Am Not Spock, reflecting the actor's break from Star Trek and his world-famous Vulcan character. Meanwhile, Paramount attempted to launch its own TV network and intended its flagship series to be Star Trek Phase II. At the time, Nimoy's relationship with Gene Roddenberry and Paramount was fractured. Leonard was smarting from Roddenberry and Paramount recasting him as the lead of the Questor tapes, and Nimoy sued the studio over licensing revenue as his likeness as Spock was being used for merchandising without compensation. Still, Star Trek Phase II made Leonard Nimoy an offer to return as Spock. However, Spock would only be in a few episodes, and he would be replaced by a new Vulcan science officer named Zahn, David Gautreaux. Nimoy flatly rejected Paramount's deal to reprise Spock in what amounted to a glorified guest star role in Star Trek Phase II. When Star Trek Phase II was retooled to become Star Trek, the motion picture, Paramount executive Jeffrey Katzenberg met with Leonard Nimoy to bring him back as Spock. Paramount settled Leonard's lawsuit, and Nimoy was convinced to don Spock's ears again and join the rest of Star Trek, the original series' cast in their feature film debut. When Star Trek The Next Generation made the leap to feature films, Leonard Nimoy was Paramount's top choice to direct Star Trek Generations, as well as return as Spock. However, Star Trek Generations screenplay, written by Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga, and overseen by executive producer Rick Berman, was developed without Nimoy's input. Nimoy passed on both directing and starring in Star Trek Generations after reading the script. Nimoy felt that Spock and the rest of Star Trek, the original series' cast, except for William Shatner's Captain Kirk, whose death the film's climax hinged on, were merely shoehorned into the prologue as glorified cameos. Not only did Leonard feel Star Trek's original cast already gave a proper farewell in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, but Nimoy also hated Star Trek Generations' overall story. There was no interest in Nimoy's input on Star Trek Generations' story from Rick Berman or Paramount. Nimoy felt if he were to direct Star Trek Generations, he should have had a hand in developing Generations the way he did Star Trek III, Star Trek IV, and Star Trek VI. Instead, he was being offered a director-for-hire job, which went to David Carson. In 1994, Leonard Nimoy assumed he had played Spock for the last time, although he and most of Star Trek, the original series' actors voiced their characters in a popular episode of Futurama. Leonard couldn't have guessed that he would say yes to his final run as Spock in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness. For generations of science fiction fans, Leonard Nimoy is Spock, an icon whose raised eyebrow and perfectly balanced half-Vulcan logic became one of the most recognizable character signatures in TV history. Yet what many don't know, and what most would never even imagine, is that Nimoy almost never stepped aboard the USS Enterprise at all. In fact, the man who became inseparable from the role turned it down twice. And in that alternate timeline, before Gene Roddenberry made the universe blink and rearrange itself, Star Trek nearly launched without its heartbeat of logic. The story begins long before the Enterprise took flight. Nimoy was a working actor in the early 1960s, known primarily for his character roles on TV westerns, anthology dramas, and noir thrillers. He had the angular face directors loved, the intensity producers loved even more, and the talent that made audiences remember him even when he appeared for only 10 minutes. But he wasn't a star. He was still fighting for every role, every line, every opportunity. So when Roddenberry approached him with an early pitch for a new kind of science fiction show, a series that would treat space travel with dignity rather than camp, Nimoy listened. And then he said no. Why? Because Roddenberry's original pitch for the Spock character was unusual, even by 1960s sci-fi standards. Spock wasn't yet the Spock we know. In early drafts, he was half Martian, bright red-skinned, described as satanic-looking, and meant to embody the alien otherness Roddenberry believed audiences were ready to accept. Nimoy feared the role would bury him under heavy makeup, turn him into a gimmick, or worse, make him impossible to cast in anything else afterward. For a working actor who had fought hard for visibility, becoming unrecognizable under layers of latex and dye felt like a professional trap. He politely passed. Roddenberry, undeterred, rewrote. The second time the offer came around, Spock was more developed, cooler, quieter, more cerebral. But the network was skeptical. Executives feared the character would be too weird, too alien to appeal to mainstream audiences. NBC famously suggested removing Spock altogether. Roddenberry pushed back, and in doing so, pushed the offer to Nimoy again. But Nimoy had reservations. He worried that playing someone emotionless, someone who deliberately rejected human warmth, would leave him boxed into a single type. Hollywood had already given him enough trouble with his sharp features and solemn presence. Why risk being typecast forever? So once again, Nimoy declined. But the universe, Star Trek's universe most of all, has a way of nudging certain destinies into place. Roddenberry wasn't done. He rewrote Spock again, refining the character with a new level of nuance. Gone was the red skin. Gone were the satanic features. What remained was something unexpected. A half-human soul at war with itself. A being who didn't reject emotion, but spent every moment holding back a tidal wave of it. A character whose internal conflict, logic versus feeling, duty versus desire, mirrored the struggles of countless real people. Spock was no longer a gimmick. He had become a metaphor. Meanwhile, Nimoy began to imagine what such a character could allow him to explore. Restraint is its own form of emotion, after all. Quiet intensity could express far more than shouting. Subtlety, if handled right, could reveal universes. And perhaps, he thought, the biggest risk of all would be letting someone else step into the pointed boots and make the role their own. So for the third time, the offer arrived, this time with Roddenberry more certain than ever. And at last, Nimoy said yes. From that yes came everything. The eyebrow lift that launched 1,000 memes. The Vulcan salute inspired by a real Jewish blessing from Nimoy's childhood. The gentle, fascinating, that became a catchphrase. The character arc that made Spock one of television's most fully realized creations. But what's even more fascinating is imagining how close the world came to losing it all. If Nimoy had turned the role down a third time, Roddenberry might have removed Spock entirely to appease NBC. Without Spock, the original series would have lacked its philosophical anchor. Kirk would have been heroic, but unbalanced. McCoy would have been emotional, but unfocused. Star Trek's signature triumvirate dynamic might have never existed. Without that tension, the show's tone would have shifted dramatically, possibly tilting toward conventional 1960s adventure rather than the thoughtful, ethically complex stories that became its hallmark. Star Trek might still have launched, but would it have survived cancellation? Would the fandom have risen so passionately years later? Would the franchise have expanded into films, spin-offs, novels, games, or billions in cultural impact? Without the symbol of the outsider striving for belonging, without Spock, it's hard to say. Nimoy himself understood this. After the show wrapped, He famously struggled with his relationship to the character. His first autobiography, I Am Not Spock, reflected his fear of being overshadowed by the role, fears rooted in those early hesitations. But by 1995, when he released I Am Spock, his perspective had changed. He no longer saw the character as a threat to his identity, but as a part of him, one that had shaped him as much as he shaped it. In later interviews, Nimoy admitted that Spock taught him discipline, patience, and emotional honesty. The character, whose nature required constant suppression of feeling, actually helped Nimoy explore his own feelings more deeply. And perhaps that is the true irony of the story. What began as a role he feared would erase him instead became the role that made him immortal. To this day, every actor who inherits Spock feels the weight of Nimoy's shadow and the privilege of it. Zachary Quinto embraced that legacy. Ethan Peck carries it forward in Strange New Worlds. But none of them forget that they are stepping into a character molded by an actor who originally wanted nothing to do with it. That's the fun of history, especially Star Trek history. We often imagine our heroes marching confidently toward destiny. But more often, destiny arrives hesitantly, in multiple drafts, with rewrites and doubts and no's that must be transformed into yes at exactly the right time. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay with us.